Continuing our reading in The World and Thorinn by Damon Knight, Chapter 1, Section 4. Fear was a cold knot in Thorinn's stomach. He took a deep breath. Another. The walls of stone around him were like a shirt laced too tight. He felt half smothered already, and yet he knew there was no lack of air. It was thirst that would kill him. That would take days. To die of thirst in a well. Never mind. He had time. A precious gift, 3 or 4 days perhaps, before he grew too weak. What else? He had his short sword, really a yen metal dagger of Gorat's, in its leather scabbard, the broad leather belt it hung from, which might be useful in climbing, his wallet, a backpack of sorts, and its contents, which he now examined, light box, fire stick and tinder, a few crumbs of cheese, a strip of dried horse meat, and a few odds and ends, colored pebbles and the like, which he had picked up because they were pretty. Then there were the clothes he wore, shirt and breeks of buckskin, horsehide shoes, and the thongs that wrapped his calves. A rope of sorts might be made of all these things together. Thorinn sat down on the floor of the well and hugged his knees for warmth. In the glow of the light box, which he had placed on a stone beside him, he saw a sudden flutter in the air. Something small and gray had darted up zigzag to vanish in the darkness. Thorinn stared upward, mouth open, then snatched the light and raised it over his head. At first he saw nothing. Then a small gray creature detached itself from the wall, spread a pair of membranous wings, and swooped erratically to the other side. It was a wing mouse, one of the darkness-loving creatures that sometimes flew out of the cave on the valley slope 2 leagues above. Where had it come from? He turned the light on the opening at his feet. This was a narrow black gash at the side of the well, no more than a span in width, but he saw now that it widened below. Kneeling, with his forehead pressed against the mud and pebbles, he was able to see a shelf of muddy earth a few ells away. It did not extend all the way under the opening, however, for he could just make out an edge of blackness on the near side. A second, deeper hole. Mud and pebbles cascaded slowly down into the darkness. The current of moist air was feeble but steady against his fingers. It seemed to rise straight toward him. Thorinn sat up, feeling his heart beat. Who cannot take the short way home must take the long, as the saying was. If he could somehow reach the cave of the wing mice. Go down, agreed the voice in his head. He pulled out his sword, jabbed the point of it into the lip of the earth over the opening. A wedge of dirt and stones came away and drifted down into the darkness. He listened, but did not hear it strike. He pried loose another wedge and another. When he had made the opening large enough to admit his body, he paused and again looked in. This time, in the dim glow of the light box, he could see a tumbled mass of muddy earth and stone, sloping like a funnel. After a moment's thought, Thorinn unwrapped the thong from one leg of his breeches and tied it securely around the light box. Kneeling again over the hole, he carefully lowered the box and let it drop. In darkness now, except for the glow that came up through the hole in the well bottom, he stood and listened. Gorat's voice still rumbled overhead. He stared upwardly a moment, silently, in the darkness, then turned and lowered himself feet first into the hole. The dim-lit cavern rose around him. He landed, staggered, caught his balance. Crouching, for there was little headroom here, he picked up the light box and brushed away the clods of gravel that had fallen on it. He held his breath to listen. The silence was so deep that he could hear the thud of his own heart. The low dirt ceiling, porous and stained reddish-brown in places, formed an irregular dome. Ceiling, walls, and floor were mud-splattered. Stones bigger than his head lay as if tossed about. The mud mound and stones sloped away, channeled and rutted. In one direction, it disappeared under a great tilted stone, leaving an opening no more than a span high. In the other, it went almost level into the darkness. Thornton untied the thong from his light box and wrapped it around his calf again. A faint current of air blew in his face as he moved down the slope. Just over his head, tongues of some crusty reddish material hung from the ceiling. Thornton tugged at one curiously and found that it was metal, rusted so thin that it broke in his hand. Below, the runneled mound grew shallower and seemed to end in a level floor with a few scattered boulders. As he descended, the ceiling rose, forming an arch overhead, as if it were in the bore of some great earthworm. The patches of rusty metal grew larger and closer together. He recognized others twisted and broken among the heaped earth and stones at his feet. Further away, the arched roof of the tunnel glittered silvery in the rust. Thornton moved along one wall, examining it as he went, and at last stopped in wonder. Between the dots and patches of rust, wall and ceiling alike gleamed with silver-gray luster. The tunnel was lined with yen metal, the incorruptible, yet it had rusted away to nothing in places. With each long step he took, another yellow segment of the tunnel bloomed out of the darkness. Presently it seemed to him that he was not moving at all, but the tunnel was leaping toward him. The tunnel was like a yellow eye with a vast black pupil at its center, and Thornton began to feel a terror of it, because it was so huge and so close. When he turned, he saw another yellow eye behind. After each step, the silence pressed in on his head, like a sound too loud to hear. He stopped when he was tired, gnawed a bit of the horse meat, and lay down to sleep. When he awoke, the yellow eyes of the tunnel were staring at him as before. He gnawed the strip of horse meat again, but that only increased his thirst. He put 2 small pebbles in his mouth and sucked at them as he went, and that helped a little. Now the tunnel began to change. There were slightly irregular areas in the even curve of the ceiling and walls, yellow glassy knobs in shape like candle wax but hard as stone. As he went on, these irregularities made the tunnel even more unpleasant. They were like blinking eyelashes along the great staring eye. He was lost. He had lost all account of the distance he had traveled. He knew that it must be 10 leagues or more, and yet he could not escape the sense that he was only leaping up and down while the stone danced toward him. He smelled the water before he heard it, a distant rushing sound in the tunnel ahead. Moment by moment it came nearer, and the breeze freshened. Now he saw that the tunnel floor was broken by a great hole 10 ells across that went down out of sight in undulating level strips of brown and cream stone. Great blocks of rubble were heaped up on either side of it, and above them he could make out a black cavity vanishing into the ceiling. It would be no great matter, he thought, to leap up from the boulders into the shaft above, and it was narrow enough to climb without a rope, but he would need both hands free. He unwrapped the thong from one leg and used it to tie the light box to his forearm. He climbed the blocks and turned the light box downward. He could not see the bottom, but the sound of the water dinned in his ears. As he gathered himself to leap, something curious happened. He took a step he had not intended. Beneath him, the water roared. He struggled in terror, but the stones dropped away, and he was falling. "Go down," said the voice in his head. And that's the end of chapter 1.